Imagine you're sitting in a laboratory. In front of you is a machine with a row of switches. A stranger sits in another room. Every time he gives a wrong answer, you're told to press another switch. 15 volts, 30 volts, 45. The number keeps going up. Then you hear him scream. He begs you to stop. But the man in the white lab coat standing beside you calmly says, "Please continue." You hesitate, you know the person in the other room is suffering, but the experimental tells you that you must continue. So here is the question. Would you keep going? In 1963, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted one of the most famous and controversial experiments in the history of psychology, and what he discovered changed the way psychologists think about obedience to authority. Let's see the experiment. Milgram wanted to answer a disturbing question. How could ordinary people participate in terrible actions simply because someone in authority told them to? He was interested in obedience after the atrocities of Nazi Germany. Were people who committed terrible acts fundamentally different from anyone else? Or could ordinary people be persuaded to do things they believed were wrong? To find out, Milgram recruited male participants and told them they were taking part in a study about learning and memory. Each participant was assigned the role of the teacher. Another person was introduced as the learner, but there was a catch. The learner was actually an actor. The entire situation had been carefully staged. The teacher was taken into a room containing a machine with switches labeled from low voltage all the way up to 450 volts. The participant was told that every time the learner answered a question incorrectly, they had to administer an electric shock, and after every mistake, the voltage increased. Then the experiment began. At first, the shocks were tiny, 15 volts, 30, 45. Everything seemed relatively normal, but eventually, the learner began making mistakes. So, the voltage increased and actor began reacting. At 150 volt, he demanded to be released. As the voltage increased, his protests became stronger. Eventually, he began screaming that at high levels, he stopped responding altogether. The participant was sitting there believing that they might be seriously hurting another human being, so naturally, many participants wanted to stop. They questioned the examiner, they became nervous, they protested, some showed intense signs of stress. But whenever they hesitated, the experimenter used a series of increasingly firm commands, things like "please continue" and "the experiment requires that you continue." And then came the shocking result. Before the experiment, Milgram asked psychologists and other people to predict how many participants would continue all the way to the maximum voltage. The expectation was that almost nobody would. But in Milgram's famous baseline condition, 65% of the participants continued all the way to 450 volts. Every participant in that condition reached at least 300 volts. Think about that. They were not criminals. They were selected because they were unusually cruel. They were ordinary people who had volunteered for a psychology experiment, and many of them were visibly uncomfortable. They were not necessarily enjoying what they were doing. They were struggling with the situation, yet many continued. So why did they obey? This is where the experiment becomes much more interesting. It isn't simply people are evil. That's not what the experiment demonstrated. Instead, Milgram showed how powerful a situation involving authority, responsibility, and social pressure can become. The participant wasn't acting completely alone. There was a scientist in prestigious-looking laboratory coat telling them what to do. The environment suggested that the experiment was legitimate and every step was gradual. 15 volts didn't feel like a huge decision. Neither did 30 or 45 or 60. But by the time the participant reached hundreds of volts, they had already taken dozens of smaller steps. The situation had slowly changed. The most interesting part. Imagine the experimenter had walked in and said, "Start by giving this person a 450 volt shock." Would most people have agreed? Probably not. But that's not how the experiment worked. It started with something small, then another small step, then another, and eventually the participant found themselves somewhere they might never have agreed to go at the beginning. This is the reason the experiment remains so psychologically fascinating. Sometimes the most powerful influence isn't "do this terrible thing." It's just take the next step. But there is an important catch. The Milgram experiment is famous, but it shouldn't be treated as a proof that 65% of the human will blindly obey authority. The study had specific conditions. Participants knew that they were taking part in a scientific experiment. The experimenter was physically present and the learner was actually an actor. Later research, including variations and reanalysis of Milgram's work, has shown that obedience changes substantially depending on the situation. For example, when the authority figure becomes less immediate or the social environment changes, obedience can decrease. So the lesson isn't humans are naturally obedient. The more interesting lesson is, are Our behavior can be strongly shaped by the situation we are placed in. And that's why this experiment still matters. Think about your own life. A boss tells you to do something you don't completely agree with. A teacher confidently tells you something must be done. A group of people believe something and you feel pressure to agree, or someone with authority tells you, don't question it, just follow the procedure. Most of these situations obviously aren't anything like Milligram's laboratory, but they raise the same psychological question. At what point do you stop following instructions and start following your own judgment? That's the uncomfortable question Milgram left with us. Because the frightening part of the experiment isn't that people are capable of obeying, it's that many participants knew they were uncomfortable and still continued. The final question, let's go back to the beginning. You're sitting in the laboratory, the machine is in front of you, the person in the other room is screaming, and authority figure calmly says, please continue. What would you do? Would you obey? Would you refuse? Would you convince yourself that someone else was responsible? We like to believe we would immediately walk away, but the Milgram experiment forces us to confront a much harder possibility. Maybe the most important question isn't whether you're a good person, maybe it's what happens when a powerful situation puts a good person under pressure. And that's what Milgram experiment so disturbing and so unforgettable. If you like this video, please hit the bell icon, subscribe to my channel and share this video.